The dawn over Kharkiv was painted in fire. The sound of artillery was not distant thunder anymore, it was a constant heartbeat of war. For months, the city had stood battered but unbroken. Families huddled in basements. Soldiers ate their rations with trembling hands. The world thought Kharkiv would fall, but instead, what came next would be studied in military academies for decades. The Kharkiv Counteroffensive was not just a battle, it was a turning point, a moment where strategy, courage, and raw desperation collided. Imagine being a young cadet at a military school, flipping through textbooks that speak of decisive maneuvers and operational brilliance. You might think of Napoleon crossing the Alps or Patton's armored dash across Europe. But if you don't know the story of Kharkiv, if you cannot trace the exact movements, feel the tension in the command rooms, and understand the risks on the battlefield, you would fail. Because this operation redefined what modern war looks like. The counteroffensive was not born overnight. It was whispered in bunkers, drafted on maps with trembling fingers, and argued over heatedly by commanders who knew they had only one chance to shift the momentum. Ukraine was bleeding. Every day, Russia pushed harder, deploying missiles, tanks, and soldiers with overwhelming firepower. Villages were reduced to ashes. Civilians were trapped between front lines. But then, a gamble emerged. It began with deception. The world watched as Ukrainian forces spoke openly, even to openly, about launching a southern offensive toward Kherson. Western analysts, Russian media, and armchair generals across the globe focused on the south. Moscow moved forces there. Bridges were bombed, and the Russian high command was convinced Kherson will be the decisive front. But Kharkiv was silent. Behind that silence lay meticulous planning. Ukrainian commanders, aided by Western intelligence, drew maps of Russian weak points north and east of Kharkiv. Supply lines were stretched thin. Morale among Russian units was low. Their best brigades had been redeployed elsewhere, and suddenly the impossible seemed possible. Soldiers on the ground described that eerie calm before the storm. One lieutenant later recalled, "We had been waiting for weeks, pretending to reinforce the south. Then one night, orders came. We move east. No hesitation. No second thoughts. We knew it was now or never. When the attack began, it was like lightning. Ukrainian armored columns burst forward, backed by artillery that pounded Russian positions with pinpoint precision. Villages that had been under occupation for months saw the yellow-blue flags return almost overnight. Russian units outnumbered in places they thought were secure crumbled. Entire battalions abandoned their positions, leaving behind ammunition, tanks, even personal belongings.
The speed was shocking. In military terms, this was not a slow push. It was a breakthrough. Ukrainian mechanized brigades advanced kilometers per day, slicing through Russian defenses as if they were paper. Western analysts watching satellite data were stunned. "This is blitzkrieg," one retired U.S. general admitted. But in reverse, Ukraine has turned the tables. Yet victory was not just about tanks and guns. It was about the people. In every village liberated, civilians wept. Grandmothers kissed soldiers' hands. Children shouted in disbelief. Farmers who had hidden Ukrainian flags under their barns finally waved them in daylight. For them, this was not just a counteroffensive. It was survival. Still, the risks were enormous. Supply lines stretched. Ammunition dwindled. A single miscalculation could have trapped advancing Ukrainian forces in a deadly pocket. Commanders had to balance daring speed with cold caution. This dance between risk and opportunity became the essence of the Kharkiv operation. But as days turned into weeks, the scale of Russian retreat became undeniable. Izium, once a major Russian stronghold, fell. Kupiansk, a key logistical hub, collapsed. Suddenly, entire sectors of the Russian frontline were gone. Soldiers deserted. Videos surfaced of abandoned Russian tanks, untouched meals left on tables, and propaganda posters littering the ground. This was more than just a tactical defeat. It was psychological shock. Moscow, which had boasted of inevitable victory, now had to explain to its people why thousands of square kilometers had been lost in a matter of days. Military academies will forever study how deception played a role. By convincing Russia that the South was the true target, Ukraine had masked its true intent. This echoes Sun Tzu's wisdom: appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend, march swiftly to places where you are not expected. And in Kharkiv, Ukraine turned theory into practice. The counteroffensive also highlighted the fusion of modern intelligence with age-old grit. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and Western-supplied precision weapons paved the way, but it was the Ukrainian soldier, often outgunned yet unbroken, who made the advance possible. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We did not feel like warriors. We felt like shadows racing through the night. But when dawn broke, and we saw our flag rise, it was worth every step." The first phase of the Kharkiv counteroffensive shocked the world. But it was only the beginning. The deeper Ukraine pushed, the greater the risks became. What if Russia regrouped? What if winter came early? Could Ukraine hold what it had taken? Or would the momentum slip away as quickly as it had arrived? To truly understand the Kharkiv counteroffensive, one must follow the story through to its end. For in its second half, when fatigue set in and Moscow sought revenge, the true test of resilience began. The Kharkiv counteroffensive wasn't just another battlefield maneuver, it was the very definition of modern maneuver warfare. And while Part 1 explained the preparation, deception, and initial strikes, Part 2 will dive into the deep operational impact, the collapse of Russian lines, and the lessons military schools will study for decades. The collapse of Russian defenses. When Ukrainian brigades surged across the Oskil River corridor, Russian forces were still scattered, convinced the main offensive remained in Kherson. By the time Russian generals realized the danger, their units in Kharkiv were already outflanked, cut off, and isolated. Russian battalions that had dug in for months suddenly found themselves without communications, supply chains, or artillery support. Videos later surfaced of Russian soldiers abandoning intact tanks and armored vehicles, retreating in disorganized columns. Ukrainian forces seized Kupiansk, the critical railway hub, effectively strangling Russian logistics to the north. Kupiansk's fall was the nail in the coffin. Without it, resupplying Izium and the broader northern front became impossible. Izium abandoned. Izium had been Russia's jewel in Kharkiv Oblast, their staging ground for the push into Donbass. The Russian flag had flown there for months. But when Ukrainian mechanized brigades encircled the city's supply routes, the Russian command made a shocking decision: abandon Izium completely. This wasn't just a tactical loss, it was a humiliation. Thousands of square kilometers, retaken in a matter of days. Abandoned Russian stockpiles revealed warehouses filled with ammunition, fuel, even personal belongings, evidence of how sudden the collapse truly was. The speed of maneuver. Ukrainian strategy exploited speed as a weapon. Instead of grinding through defenses, they raced past strongpoints, bypassing Russian trenches and striking rear positions. This is classic maneuver warfare. Force the enemy to fight in directions they didn't expect, while cutting off escape routes. One Ukrainian commander later said, "We didn't fight them for every trench, we drove so fast, they couldn't understand where we'd appear next." This lightning advance, sometimes described as a rolling wave, overwhelmed Russian commanders, who had grown complacent in static warfare. Psychological warfare, perhaps the most decisive weapon